Let's discuss this development now further with Dr. Darrell Bricker. He is the Canadian author, pollster, public speaker, political scientist and political commentator. Very good evening to you and thank you so much for speaking to us. So just looking at this huge jump in population, I believe that it's 3 times higher than the 2.5 billion global headcount in 1950. So what accounts for this jump in numbers?
Well, the biggest thing that accounts for it is that we're just simply living longer than we used to live. So one of the things that is in the UN data but doesn't get talked about very much is most of the population growth that we've got going in the world today is not as a result of many, many more children coming into the population, but simply that older people are living longer than they used to. So even in a place like China back in 1940, or 1950, the average person in China lived to the age of about 40 years old. They're now living into their late 70s. So whatever population is growing, it tends to be that older part of the population rather than new children coming into the world.
It's interesting that you say that because I see, according to the UN report, that after a peak in the early 1960s, the world's population growth rate actually decelerated dramatically.
Yeah, and they are correct about that. So even though we've hit 8 billion, it's really slowing down. And I would suspect that we're not going to have a day like this that we celebrate 9 billion. There's a very good chance it'll peter out by the time we get to mid-century, and it will start to decline. And we'll probably end the century not where the UN says we're going to be at 10.4 billion people, but probably fairly close to where we are today.
So if the annual growth rate fell from a high of 2.1% between 1962 and 1965 to below 1% in 2020, could it potentially fall further to around 0.5% by 2050? And if we're saying that there's an improvement, for instance, in healthcare and personal hygiene, does the decline in fertility rate then account for this deceleration?
Right. So there's a very good chance it won't be 0.5 in 2050. It could be below that. In fact, the population could reach a tipping point at that time. Yes, everything that you say relating to healthcare extends the life of people who are already here on the planet. But the issue that we have in the world today is that we're just not getting as many children into the world as we used to. So even if you look at your own country in South Africa, if you go back to 1960, the birth rate was 6.2, and in your report correctly stated 2.1's replacement rate. In a place like South Africa, it's actually a little higher because infant mortality is higher than it is in other places. But today, the birth rate in South Africa is 2.3. Very, very close to just being at replacement rate today. So there's been a dramatic contraction in less than 65 years in South Africa, but that's happening everywhere in the world. So even in places that we would see as more developing type markets, even if you went to the Sahel, say, for example, in Africa, yes, the birth rate's still pretty high, higher than it is in South Africa, but it's also coming down. So that's the issue. Population isn't going to be increasing longer term because we've just not having as many children as we used to have.
It's interesting because I'm actually just recalling back to the development of the MDGs, and just from a health perspective, that at some point there was such over-concentration of ensuring that we reduce infant mortality rates that the 0 to 5 population group was then being neglected. The bigger question is how many people can the Earth actually support? Because I believe that it has 2 sides, natural limits and human choices.
Yeah, the answer to that question is we really don't know. I mean, if you go back to Robert Malthus back in the, in the 18th century, it was already too many people then. And we've had, everything from the Club of Rome to, the Population Bomb book by Paul Ehrlich, all saying that, we have this catastrophic inability to be able to sustain global population. The truth is, there are issues on the Earth today, but we are sustaining the global population. There's probably a bit more capacity to be able to take care of whatever is going to increase in the future, but we're going to hit a wall. and not far off from hitting a wall in terms of population growth, and it's going to start to come down. And there's potential it could come down rather precipitously. So the argument that the debate on population is going to change over time from how many people are on the face of the earth to how old the population is going to be on the face of the earth and how incapable it's going to become of actually even replacing itself, because we only replace population the old-fashioned way. I mean, there's no other way to replace humanity and other than having children, and we've just really declined in that particular area.
So continuing in that vein, where do you stand on this? Is it overpopulation in terms of what the Earth can handle, and is there overconsumption? Is this what is exacerbating the problem?
Well, one could argue on either part of that. I mean, what is overconsumption? What is overpopulation? I think in both areas we tend to get a little bit hyperbolic and really agitated on some of these questions. Mm-hmm. But when you sit down and you take a look at the data, the story is actually quite a bit more positive than I think tends to get told, even by the 8 billion number that the UN has put out. And as you correctly noted earlier in the report, it's actually a good news story in the sense that it's showing that people are, healthcare has improved, diets have improved, all the things that used to kill people prematurely are all getting better for the most part. So this is a product of basically progress.
So the population growth and its impact on the environment, especially that of economic development, what is it?
Well, population, where you see high birth rates and rapidly increasing population, it tends to be in places where there's poverty. There's a lack of women's rights and women's ability to make choices about their lives, and a lack of education. And on all of those things, as you correctly noted before, the UN's really focused. And the effect of that has been, rather than to increase set the conditions for further population increase, it's actually going to work in exactly the opposite direction. So in particular, as women get more ability to control their own fertility, the chances are what they do is they actually reduce the number of children that they have. So that's why we're going to be hitting this wall as we hit mid-century, and population rates are going to start to decline.
Thank you so much for your time, Dr. Darrell Bricker, Canadian political scientist and commentator.